You know when you're watching like a corporate keynote or maybe a really high-stakes political debate,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
and someone just suddenly drops a phrase like, I don't know, synergistic paradigm shift or,
Or strategic realignments.
yes, exactly, strategic realignments. It's a very specific feeling you get when you hear that.
It's intimidating, right?
It is. You're sitting there and you kind of realize, oh, wait, they aren't actually trying to convey information to me right now.
Not at all. It's a complete flex.
Right. It is a flex. It's a way of claiming, the physical and the intellectual space in the room.
Oh, for sure.
Like they are building this invisible, just impenetrable wall of vocabulary and deliberately standing on top of it.
It is entirely about establishing a hierarchy.
Yeah.
We intuitively understand on a very primal level, I think, that the person using the densest, most complex terminology is, well, they're demanding authority.
They're making you work for it.
Exactly. They are forcing you to process their language completely on their terms. So before a single substantive argument is even made, the power dynamic has been completely tilted.
Which is exactly why looking at the linguistic data on William Shakespeare, it completely recalibrated how I think about his plays this week.
It really changes everything, doesn't it?
It does, because we're doing a deep dive today into some really fascinating historical and linguistic sources. And, we always praise him for being the ultimate poet.
Right, the guy who makes everything sound beautiful or tragic.
Exactly. But when you actually count the words,
The literal words.
specifically the ones he literally invented from scratch,
Yeah.
you realize he was doing the exact same thing a modern CEO does.
Oh, absolutely.
He was basically weaponizing the dictionary to tell the audience exactly who was in charge.
He was using word origins as a literal theatrical tool.
Yeah, and the sources we have for this deep dive are incredible.
They are. We have this massive body of textual data and historical analysis that tracks how Shakespeare utilized what linguists call Latinate neologisms.
Okay, Latinate neologisms. Break that down for us real quick.
So these are basically newly coined words that are built from Latin roots.
Right.
And the data shows he didn't just, scatter these new words around randomly because they sounded pretty.
Like a poet just tossing flowers around.
Exactly. He didn't do that at all. He hoarded them.
He hoarded them.
Yes. He strategically deployed them to signal dominance. And the way he did it completely evolved as he matured as a writer.
So, okay, I want you to imagine, just put yourself in this scenario. You're standing in the pit at the Globe Theater in, say, 1606.
Okay, I'm there. It smells terrible, probably.
Oh, absolutely reeking. You're surrounded by merchants, apprentices, probably some pickpockets.
Definitely pickpockets.
And everyone is speaking rough, everyday street slang.
Right, early modern English.
Yeah. Suddenly, an actor walks out onto the stage and drops a multisyllabic Latin-heavy word that literally no one in the room has ever heard before.
Never.
It immediately forces your brain to snap to attention, doesn't it?
It recalibrates the entire atmosphere of the theater.
Yeah.
But to really understand how radical that was, we actually have to step back and look at the environment he was writing in.
The 15th and 16th century Renaissance.
Right. Because it was a period of overwhelming, almost violent linguistic upheaval in England. You had two massive forces colliding.
Because England was relatively insular for a long time, linguistically speaking, right?
Very much so.
Like the everyday language was heavily rooted in Anglo-Saxon.
Yes.
It was functional. It was the words for dirt, blood, bone, house, sleep.
Exactly. The grunts of daily survival, almost. But then two big things happen. First, the intellectual floodgates open with the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Latin texts.
Right, the Renaissance hits.
Yes. All this classical philosophy, science, and rhetoric that had been, locked away or just ignored in Western Europe suddenly comes rushing back into the cultural mainstream.
Just a massive influx of ideas.
Huge. And second, and practically more important, William Caxton introduces the printing press to England around 1476.
Which completely changes the speed of everything.
Completely.
Because information isn't just for a handful of monks meticulously copying manuscripts in some freezing scriptorium anymore.
No, it's mass-produced.
Right. It's traveling across borders. You have merchants coming back from the Mediterranean. You've got scientists discovering new concepts.
And navigators mapping new trade routes.
Exactly. And the English language, as it existed, just physically could not handle the bandwidth.
It couldn't. It simply did not possess the vocabulary to describe these new philosophical concepts or, mathematical theories or foreign goods.
It was running out of words.
Exactly. So the language had to expand rapidly. Historians estimate that English incorporated roughly 10,000 new lexemes during this specific period.
Wait, 10,000.
10,000 new words entering the lexicon.
That is a staggering influx.
Mhm.
I mean, think about how much people complain today when like a dozen new internet slang terms get added to the dictionary every year.
Oh, people lose their minds over it.
They really do. The cultural friction of 10,000 new foreign-sounding words must have been intense.
It was incredibly polarizing. Whenever you have a rapid cultural and technological shift, you get an immediate reactionary pushback.
Naturally.
The traditionalists, the purists of the era, they absolutely despise these new additions.
Because it wasn't pure English.
Right. They viewed the influx of Latin Greek terms as a literal contamination of the, quote, pure English tongue. They felt the language was being corrupted by intellectual elites.
They actually had a specific insult for these complex, newly imported words, didn't they?
I did.
I saw this in the sources. They called them inkhorn terms.
Oh, inkhorn terms, yes.
What exactly was an inkhorn?
So an inkhorn was the literal vessel made out of an animal horn that scholars used to hold their ink.
Oh, okay.
By calling them inkhorn terms, the purists were implying that these words, well, they smelled of the dusty study.
Right, like they were artificial.
Exactly. They didn't come from the soil. They didn't come from the real world. They were pretentious, manufactured jargon designed to make the speaker sound superior.
So was Shakespeare essentially the Elizabethan equivalent of a tech bro?
A tech bro.
Yeah, like, was he just throwing around disruptive, cutting-edge jargon to annoy the older generation and show off how avant-garde he was?
Well, he was definitely a disruptor, but I wouldn't call him a tech bro.
Fair enough.
Because his intention wasn't just to be trendy. He was acutely aware of what linguists call the plasticity of early modern English.
Meaning it was flexible.
Very. The language was in a molten state. The rules of grammar and vocabulary hadn't completely solidified yet. There were no standard dictionaries really locking things down.
Right.
And Shakespeare recognized a fundamental psychological truth about his audience. A Latinate word sounded inherently more educated, more foreign, and fundamentally more authoritative than an Anglo-Saxon word.
Because the Anglo-Saxon words belonged to the peasants.
Right.
But the Latin words belonged to the church. They belonged to the law courts. They belonged to the history of the Roman Empire.
Precisely. They carried the heavy institutional weight of history.
Okay, wow.
So if you're a playwright and you want to instantly communicate to some illiterate groundling that the character currently speaking is a king or a general or a highly educated nobleman,
You don't just put a velvet cloak on them.
you put Latin in their mouth. It elevates the speaker above the common fray in a way that physical costuming simply can't match.
Okay, so he's in his workshop, he knows the language is malleable, and he knows Latin equals power.
Yes.
Let's look at exactly how he manufactured these words. Because he wasn't just pulling a Latin dictionary off the shelf and reading from it, was he?
No, he was building custom linguistic machinery.
And the data we have on this from the sources is incredibly specific. It's largely thanks to the work of linguists like Brian A. Garner.
Garner's methodology is fascinating. He isolated a very specific type of word.
Because he wasn't just counting every time Shakespeare used a word for the first time in print, right?
Exactly. He specifically isolated the Latinate neologisms, words that Shakespeare built himself using Latin bases.
And how many did he find?
Across the entire surviving body of Shakespeare's work, Garner identified exactly 626 of these specific power words.
626 brand new inventions.
Yeah.
But the criteria for what makes it onto that list requires a bit of parsing. We are talking about new words with Latin bases containing at least one bound Latinate morpheme or hybrid word.
Right, let's break that down mechanically.
Please do.
A morpheme is just the smallest unit of language that carries meaning.
Okay.
A bound morpheme is a piece of a word that cannot stand alone as its own word, like a prefix or a suffix. The prefix un is a bound morpheme. It means nothing by itself.
It doesn't mean anything until you attach it to something like unhappy.
Exactly.
So a hybrid word is where he's kind of playing Dr. Frankenstein.
That's a great way to put it.
He takes a perfectly normal English word and violently bolts a Latin piece onto it.
The perfect example from his plays is the word contentless.
Contentless.
Right. He takes content, a concept the audience completely understands, and slaps the suffix less onto it. He is stitching different linguistic traditions together in real time.
But the data also shows a massive failure rate, doesn't it?
It does.
Out of those 626 carefully crafted power words, About 1/3 of them completely died out.
Yep.
They never entered the permanent English vocabulary. They lived on the stage for a few hours and then vanished. If this strategy was so brilliant, why did a full third of his inventions fail?
Because English is fundamentally a Germanic language, and it has a certain phonetic rhythm and a certain tolerance. When you forcefully graft Latin rules onto Germanic roots, sometimes the linguistic tissue rejects the organ.
Ah, right. It just doesn't take.
Many of the words that failed were actually ill-formed according to the strict formal rules of Latin word formation. They were grammatically incorrect.
I am fascinated by the idea of Shakespeare making grammatical errors on purpose.
It sounds crazy, right?
He clearly had some classical education. He knew enough Latin to read the source material for his plays. So if he's violating the rules of Latin syntax, he's doing it deliberately. Why?
Because he was an artist prioritizing the theatrical experience over academic pedantry.
Okay.
He was chasing a specific phonetic sound, a specific rhythm, or a specific emotional weight. If a grammatically correct Latin construction sounded weak on stage, he would warp the grammar until it sounded like a thunderclap.
Let's look at a prime example of this working perfectly, because there's one that really stands out.
Oh, there is.
One of the most famous Latinate neologisms he ever dropped is in Macbeth. It's the word incarnadine.
It is an absolute masterclass in this exact technique.
Let's set the scene for the listener. So Macbeth has just murdered King Duncan in his sleep.
Right.
It's the ultimate treason. He walks out of the king's chamber, holding the bloody daggers, absolutely paralyzed by what he's just done.
He's in shock.
Total shock. He looks down at his hands, covered in the king's blood, and he realizes that all the water in the ocean won't be enough to wash them clean. Instead, his bloody hands will turn the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red.
Incarnadine.
Yeah.
Before this specific performance, that word did not exist in English as a verb in this context.
Never used before.
Right. It derives from the Latin root carn, meaning flesh, so it means to make flesh-colored, or to redden.
But if the meaning is just to redden, why not just say that? In fact, he literally provides the Anglo-Saxon translation in the very next line, making the green one red.
He does?
And that line is almost entirely monosyllabic, harsh, everyday English words, making the green one red.
Now, think about the physical act of the actor delivering that line on stage. To say making the green one red requires very little breath. It's blunt. It's brutal.
Yeah, it's fast.
But the line before it, multitudinous seas incarnadine, forces the actor to slow down. They have to draw in a massive breath just to navigate all those syllables.
Multitudinu, incarnadine. It literally takes up so much physical space in the mouth.
Exactly. He conjured the word into existence because the Anglo-Saxon word redden was simply too small, too domestic to hold the cosmic weight of Macbeth's guilt.
Right, because Macbeth hasn't just killed a guy in a bar fight.
No, he has murdered the divine right of kings. He has fractured the universe. The vocabulary required to describe the blood on his hands needs to sound vast, ancient, and permanent. The multisyllabic Latin accomplishes exactly that.
And it's not the only heavy hitter in that play either. Macbeth is also the first documented use of the word assassination.
Right. Think about that. Murder was an old word. A thief in an alleyway commits a murder.
Sure.
But a general killing his sovereign. That requires a totally different lexical weight. The hissing sounds of assassination carry a sense of treachery, of serpentine political scheming.
Ass inundation.
Yeah.
It really does hiss.
It does. He utilized the plasticity of the language to fill a gap where English was emotionally insufficient.
So we have a really clear picture of the tools now. We understand how these Latinate neologisms function as a kind of sonic heavy artillery.
Sonic heavy artillery. I like that.
But if we track the chronology of his plays, the data proves he didn't just walk into the Globe Theater on day one with his fully formed strategy, did he?
Not at all. He had to learn how to use this weaponry.
So there was a learning curve.
Oh, a huge one. If we look at those statistics for his earlier works, which are predominantly comedies and history plays, the frequency of these Latinate neologisms is quite low.
Like how low?
The comedies from his early period average only about 0.59 Latinate neologisms per 1,000 words.
0.59 per 1,000. That feels surprisingly low for the guy we think of as the ultimate wordsmith.
It does.
You look at early comedies like The Two Gentlemen of Verona or The Taming of the Shrew, and not only are the numbers low, but the power words they do have are scattered pretty evenly among the cast.
Right.
You don't have one character standing above the rest, courting all the fancy vocabulary.
No, in these juvenile works, he is clearly in an experimental phase, You could kind of call it his sandbox phase.
He's just playing around.
He's playing with the morphological processes, testing out what works and what doesn't. He's incredibly witty, obviously, and the linguistic fireworks are there. But he hasn't yet linked complex vocabulary to structural dominance.
So what is he using them for?
He's using inkhorn terms mostly for comedic effect, like to make a pedantic schoolmaster look foolish, for instance, rather than using them to establish a king's absolute authority.
Okay, I can understand the comedies being experimental, but what really threw me when I looked at the numbers from the sources was the history plays.
Yeah, that's the interesting part.
His early histories averaged the lowest frequency of all his genres, sitting at just 0.41 Latinate neologisms per 1,000 words.
The lowest of all of them.
Why? I mean, a history play is literally about kings, crowns, and political power. If Latin equals power, shouldn't Richard III be speaking entirely in newly invented syllables?
It seems totally counterintuitive, but it actually makes perfect sense when you consider the nature of historical drama.
Okay, lay it on me.
When Shakespeare is writing Richard III or the Henry VI plays, he is chronicling real English kings and real bloody battles that his audience already knows about.
Right, it's history. They know how it ends.
Exactly. The power of those characters is already established by history.
Oh, I see. So he doesn't need to artificially inflate them.
Precisely. If a character is walking around wearing the actual historical crown of England, the audience implicitly understands their authority.
The physical crown is doing the heavy lifting.
Yes. Shakespeare was relying on the inherent historical and political weight of the subject matter. He didn't feel the need to construct a new vocabulary to make a real king feel important. The king was already important.
That makes total sense. But then something happens. Right at the end of the 1590s, the strategy completely shifts. The data points to one specific play as the bridge between his early experimentation and his mature mastery.
Yes.
Henry V, written around 1599. The math suddenly changes here.
The change is dramatic. In Henry V, the overall usage spikes to 0.83 Latinate neologisms per 1,000 words.
That is more than double the average of his earlier history plays.
Double. And the critical detail is who is using them.
Right.
King Henry alone gets 7 of these neologisms. He completely dominates the linguistic count.
7 might not sound like a massive number in isolation, but when the rest of the cast gets 0 or 1, it is a monopoly.
It is a total monopoly.
What is it about Henry V that forces Shakespeare to abandon his previous rule about history plays and suddenly turn the king into this linguistic titan?
You have to look at the narrative crisis of the play. Henry is leading an exhausted, sick, outnumbered English army into France.
Things are not going well.
No. And importantly, this army is not a unified monolith. Shakespeare goes out of his way to highlight the cultural friction within the ranks. He writes scenes featuring an Irish captain, a Welsh captain, and a Scottish captain.
Oh, right. And they are all arguing with each other in these incredibly thick, heavy regional dialects.
Right. Linguists refer to this as a confusio linguarum, a confusion of tongues.
A confusion of tongues.
It's a cacophony of regional accents, rough slang, and mud-level perspective. The army is fractured by their language.
So when Henry steps into the center of this chaos, he can't just speak like a regular guy.
He can't.
He can't speak Anglo-Saxon mudslang.
No, he has to rise above it. Henry V uses this elevated, newly minted Latinate language to literally float above the dialects of his soldiers.
Wow.
When he speaks, his vocabulary is so dense, so pristine, and so uniquely his own that it neutralizes the regional squabbles. He doesn't just unite them by holding a sword and wearing a crown. He unites them by speaking a language that transcends their differences.
That's incredible.
He creates a linguistic throne, and he sits on it.
He realizes that if he gives the king the biggest, newest words, the audience feels the gravity of his authority on a subconscious level. Henry V is the bridge, because once the calendar flips past 1600, we enter his mature period. And the use of these words just explodes, specifically in one genre. Let's talk about the tragedy spike.
The statistics here are impossible to ignore. His mature tragedies have the highest overall frequency of any genre, averaging 0.88 Latinate neologisms per 1,000 words.
Okay.
But within that genre, there is an inner circle, the plays we call his big 4 mature tragedies.
Macbeth, Othello, King Lear, and Hamlet.
The heavyweights.
The absolute heavyweights of world literature. What do the numbers look like for them?
Macbeth hits 1.10 per 1,000 words. King Lear is practically identical at 1.11. And then there is the summit, the absolute peak of this linguistic mountain, Hamlet.
Hamlet.
Hamlet clocks in at a staggering 1.68 Latinate neologisms per 1,000 words.
1.68. The density of invented complex language in Hamlet is almost hard to wrap your head around compared to where he started.
It's massive.
Why the sudden explosion? I mean, I don't buy that he just suddenly bought a better Latin dictionary,
No, obviously not.
Let me float a theory here. We've been talking about these words as markers of political power.
Right.
But Hamlet doesn't have political power.
He doesn't.
He's a prince, sure, but he's locked out of the kingship by his uncle. His problem isn't leading an army. His problem is his own mind.
That is the crucial distinction.
So, is it a matter of psychological resolution? Like, in the early comedies, he's basically working with standard definition 1080p emotional resolution. I am sad. I am in love.
Right.
But in the mature tragedies, he starts dealing with genuine, terrifying madness. He's dealing with existential dread, suicidal ideation, cosmic injustice. Did the old Anglo-Saxon words just stop working?
Basically, yes.
Did he physically need to upgrade to a 4K linguistic vocabulary just to render the complexity of what these characters were feeling?
I think that 4K analogy is perfectly accurate. The upgrade was structurally necessary. The standard vocabulary was insufficient to map the interiority of someone like Hamlet or Lear. Think about the nature of tragedy. It is deeply isolating. The protagonists are fundamentally alone with their fracturing minds.
Right. I mean, he literally invents the word unmanly in Hamlet and the word lonely in Coriolanus.
Stop and think about that. The concept of being physically alone obviously existed.
Here.
The Anglo-Saxons knew what it meant to be solitary. But the specific emotional ache, the internal psychological state of feeling lonely, that specific adjectival form first appears in Shakespeare's tragedy.
That blows my mind.
He needed it to describe a very specific kind of tragic isolation.
It's incredible. He has to build the word before the character can even feel the emotion.
Exactly. When Hamlet is standing alone, contemplating whether existence itself is worth the pain, he cannot use the simple vocabulary of a comedy. A fractured, highly complex, geometric Latin vocabulary mirrors his fractured, over-analytical mental state.
The language is the architecture of his suffering.
Beautifully said, yes.
Which brings us to the most fascinating realization in all of this data from the sources. It's not just that he invented more words for the tragedies, it is how he distributed them.
Yes, the distribution is key.
We saw a glimpse of this with Henry V, but in the mature tragedies, it becomes an ironclad rule. It is a structural monopoly.
In the big four tragedies, the Latinate neologisms are ruthlessly hoarded by the primary characters, the kings, the queens, the generals, the people whose internal decisions and external actions govern the reality of the plot.
Let's put some numbers to it. In Hamlet, which has that massive 1.68 frequency rate, Prince Hamlet himself speaks 19 of these newly minted power words.
19.
King Claudius, his rival, the man currently sitting on the throne, speaks 10. And the rest of the cast, the guards, the courtiers, Ophelia.
They get mere scraps. 1 or 2, maybe?
So the vast majority of the new language is locked in a tug of war between the two most powerful men in Elsinore.
We see the exact same architecture in Macbeth. Macbeth violently seizes the throne, and he simultaneously seizes the vocabulary. He gets 8 of these Latinate neologisms. He dominates the linguistic space of the play, just as he physically dominates the Scottish kingdom.
But wait, let me challenge this theory for a second.
Go for it.
If this is a hard and fast rule, that the hoarding of complex words equates to royal authority, what about the characters who are fundamentally anti-authority?
Like who?
Shakespeare's famous for his fools and his clowns, right? The gravediggers, the jesters. They are constantly talking back to kings.
Very true.
Do they use these Latin power words? Doesn't a fool dropping a massive Latinate word ruin the idea of the audible crown?
It's a brilliant question, and the way Shakespeare handles the fools actually reinforces the rule.
How so?
When the lower class characters or the fools attempt to use these massive, complex Latinate words, they almost always get them wrong.
The malapropisms?
Exactly. A character like Dogberry in Much Ado About, nothing will try to sound authoritative by using a giant multisyllabic word, but he'll use the completely wrong word.
Right.
It's played for laughs. The audience laughs because they recognize that the commoner doesn't have the intellectual right or the capability to wield the power words correctly.
So their failure proves the rule.
The failure of the fool to use the language properly only highlights the true authority of the noble characters who can wield it seamlessly.
That's fascinating. The fools are basically playing with a loaded gun and shooting themselves in the foot, which proves the gun belongs to the king.
Exactly.
Okay, but let me throw another wrench in the gears. What are the villains?
The villains.
If Latinate words signal authority and the right to rule, you'd think the noble heroes would get all of them. Let's look at Othello. Othello is the general, he is the title character, but Iago is the one pulling the strings behind his back.
Right.
Does Iago get locked out of the vocabulary because he's a subordinate?
Not at all. In fact, the data here is incredibly revealing. In Othello, the title character speaks 11 of these words. But Iago, who is merely a subordinate officer, speaks 8.
8. That is a massive number for a guy who is supposed to just be taking orders.
It is, because Shakespeare understood that power isn't just about moral authority or the rank on your uniform. It's about narrative authority.
Narrative authority.
Yes. Literary critics often describe Iago as an arch-dramatist. Within the reality of the play, Iago is essentially writing the script. He plants the ideas, he manipulates the physical evidence, he controls what everyone else sees and believes.
He builds the labyrinth, and everyone else just wanders through it.
Precisely. So the linguistic data proves that giving a character a high density of Latinate neologisms isn't just about who sits on a literal throne. It is Shakespeare's structural way of whispering to the audience, watch this person. This person controls the reality of the room.
Oh, I love that.
Even if they don't wear the physical crown, if they control the vocabulary, they hold the power. It is an audible crown.
An audible crown.
Yeah.
If you hear someone dropping these dense, multisyllabic, Latin-rooted bombs into the conversation, you are listening to the person who is actually steering the ship.
The data proves it over and over.
Maybe there's an anomaly in the data, isn't there?
There is.
Because with Shakespeare, there is always an exception that proves the rule. If the standard operating procedure is that the title character or the ultimate ruler gets the most Latinate words, there is one play where the math is completely, glaringly backward.
Yes. And it is perhaps the most elegant piece of data in this entire study. We have to talk about the tragedy of Antony and Cleopatra.
Let's lay out the baseline first. Normally, in a Shakespearean pair, the first name in the title holds the linguistic dominance. Romeo speaks more and has more linguistic authority than Juliet.
Right.
Troilus holds more than Cressida. The title sets the hierarchy. But in Antony and Cleopatra, the numbers are entirely inverted. Cleopatra has 8 Latinate neologisms. And Antony, the great Roman triumvir, the man whose name comes first, he only has 2.
It's a complete subversion of the audience's expectations. You have to remember, the English language naturally favors the rhythmic cadence of Antony and Cleopatra. It's a metrical reality. Just like we say bed and breakfast, we don't say breakfast and bed.
It just feels wrong in the mouth.
Right. So Shakespeare was constrained by the natural syntactic rhythm of English when he named the play. He had to put Antony first. But once you open the text, he completely subverts that hierarchy.
Why do it? Why starve Antony of the power words and give them all to Cleopatra?
Because it reflects the fundamental tragedy of the narrative. The sun is setting on Mark Antony. His era of unrivaled Roman power is over. His political instincts are failing, and he is losing his grip on the world.
He's a fading star.
Exactly. Cleopatra, on the other hand, is vibrant, infinitely complex, calculating, and she is always a few steps ahead of everyone else in the play, including Antony.
She dictates the terms of their relationship, and ultimately she dictates the terms of her own death.
Right.
She absolutely refuses to be paraded through Rome as a captive.
Exactly. By giving her the overwhelming linguistic dominance and 8-to ratio, Shakespeare is proving to the audience on a subconscious, sonic level that she is the one truly in control.
Even though Antony's name is on the marquee.
Yes. She outtalks him, she outthinks him, and she holds the verbal power. He uses the data of the text to actively undermine the title of his own play.
It is such a brilliant, subtle manipulation of the audience. Okay, before we wrap up this massive evolution, we have to look outside the plays for just a second. We have to give a brief nod to his poetry.
Oh, the poetry is a whole different beast.
Because if you think 1.68 words per thousand in Hamlet is a lot, the data for his poems is absolutely wild.
The poetry exists in a completely different linguistic stratosphere. If you look at The Phoenix and the Turtle, which is a deeply philosophical, highly allegorical poem, the frequency is an astonishing 10.66 Latinate neologisms per 1,000 words.
10.66. That makes Hamlet look like a children's book. Why such an insane spike?
Because the medium demands a different approach. A play, even a tragedy, still has to mimic the cadence of natural human speech. Characters have to interrupt each other, they have to breathe, they have to sound relatively human.
Sure, they're talking to each other.
But Renaissance poetry was not meant to sound like a conversation at the pub. It inherently demanded a learned language.
It was an academic exercise.
It was meant to be elevated, dense, and intellectually rigorous. Latinate words were the ultimate signifier of a prestigious, highly educated poet. When Shakespeare writes a poem like that, he isn't trying to establish a character's dominance over a stage, he is flexing a different kind of muscle.
He is establishing his own dominance.
He is establishing his own personal authority over the literary establishment of his era. He is proving he can play the highest intellectual game there is.
So let's pull all these incredible threads together. We started by looking at a bunch of dry statistics from the sources about word origins, literally counting prefixes and suffixes. But what we've actually uncovered is the blueprint for how Shakespeare constructed power.
We've traced the evolution of a genius learning how to use his tools.
Exactly. He didn't just invent words to be pretty or to show off how massive his vocabulary was. He evolved as a psychological thinker and as a dramatist.
It really did.
He started out tossing newly invented Latin-based words into his early comedies just to play with the sounds. Then, he realized in his history plays that these words could be used to elevate a king above the chaos of his subjects. And finally, in his mature tragedies, he deliberately and ruthlessly hoarded this complex vocabulary for his main characters.
He used Latinate neologisms as a literal piece of theatrical technology. They signified dominance, they provided the necessary psychological depth for characters who were losing their minds, and they established ultimate authority. He understood better than almost anyone that whoever controls the language controls the reality of the narrative.
So next time you read a Shakespeare play or watch a performance, don't just passively listen to the plot. Don't just listen to what is being said. I want you to listen to the machinery of the words themselves.
Listen to the structure.
Listen to the physical syllables. Pay attention to who is using the biggest, the newest, the most complex words in the room. Because the data tells us, without fail, that is the person holding the puppet strings.
They're the ones wearing the audible crown.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We started this deep dive talking about corporate keynotes and political debates. We've seen how Shakespeare used complex, newly minted Latinate words to establish a character's absolute authority and dominance over others. Think about how that translates to today.
It's everywhere.
How do modern politicians, or tech CEOs, or financial leaders use modern neologisms and impenetrable jargon? When a leader stands at a podium and throws around buzzwords that didn't even exist 10 years ago, are they really just trying to be precise? Or are they, like King Lear, like Claudius, or like Iago, actively building a linguistic wall of authority?
Something to think about.
Are they crafting a modern audible crown specifically designed to ensure you feel too intimidated to question their power? Keep an ear out for the modern inkhorn terms.